I am so excited that we are into season 3 of my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. When I first began this podcast, I had no idea that it would take off. I began it because I genuinely want more people to listen, reflect, and learn about how our life experiences can influence us in ways that we cannot begin to imagine. Due to the wonderful candid stories my speakers have shared, I now know that my podcast is ranked in the top 5% globally. I want to thank all my speakers for this huge achievement. As always, if you enjoy it, please do share, rate, and review. Thank you for listening. Welcome, everybody. I have somebody quite interesting that I'm about to speak to today for our Stories of Unconscious Bias. I've got Katharine Birbalsingh. Katharine is headmistress and co-founder of Michaela Community School in Wembley, London. Michaela School is known for its tough love behaviour systems, knowledge curriculum, and teaching of kindness and gratitude. In 2017, the Office for Standards in Education, Children's Services and Skills graded the school as outstanding in every category. In 2019, the GCSE results showed 54% of graded papers getting a grade 7 or above, with 90% 4 to 9 in maths and 90% 4 to 9 in English. Katharine read philosophy and modern languages at the University of Oxford and has always been teaching in inner London. She's made numerous appearances on television and radio and has written for several UK publications. Katharine has written 2 books and edited a third, and a fourth called The Power of Culture, which has just been published. Whether you agree with Katharine or not, she will make you think. I sometimes wonder, Katharine, whether you're like Marmite. But if you really want to know more about Katharine, do follow her on Twitter, and her Twitter handle is @miss_Sneffy. So, Katharine, I'm excited to talk to you about Stories of Unconscious Bias, and I really appreciate that you've joined this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
So, unconscious bias, I mean, that's the kind of headline. What do you understand by those 2 words?
Well, it's things you're not conscious of, just thoughts that you might have about people you encounter in life. It could be brief, it could be actually longer term relationships. And you assume certain things about them, could be both positive and negative, uh, without any just cause. And I say just cause, meaning that it could be because of their gender, their race, their religion. It could be because of their politics. It could be their class. It could be any of those characteristics. You look at someone and you think, for instance, you see a blonde woman and you think she must be stupid. That's a very crude example of,
Mm-hmm.
of unconscious bias. And I think we all have these kind of biases. It's natural and normal to have them. And I suppose the reason why these days we talk about them is because you want, as a person, I think, to work to have as few unconscious biases as possible, or at least be self-aware enough to know when you have them so that you can counter that and check that each time. Because not just about being a better person, but actually I just think you're more likely to get situations right. You don't want to misjudge encounters. You don't want to misjudge people. And so it's best to always be thinking about what unconscious bias you might have so that you're more likely to get it right.
You're so right, because I mean, and that's the hard bit, isn't it? Because, and I mean, the 2 things that you said here that I just want to respond to. One is that so many people assume that unconscious bias might be a negative opinion or judgment on X, Y, or Z, whereas it could be positive or negative. And I think that's really important for all of us listeners to accept and understand. And the second, of course, is the extremely difficult thing of actually reflecting and thinking and exploring what does this mean to us. But of course, in the long run, it makes so much more sense. I just wanted to
Well,
share a tiny
but if
story.
I
Yeah, go
just
ahead.
say,
Yeah.
and of course, the reason why I think it's such a contentious subject is because people who want to talk about unconscious bias can make it into a kind of club that they beat other people with. And they make people feel as if they're somehow bad people for having unconscious bias, when actually it's just a perfectly normal human trait to have unconscious bias.
Thank you for
Um,
that. Yeah.
and you'll notice that I said, well, you want to think about it because you want to get things right. So I'm not saying people should think about their unconscious biases because otherwise you're a deep racist or because you're a mean person. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, the brigade who tend to talk about this, that's what they do. They shove it down people's throats. And then what it forces the other side to do is they retreat and say, I don't have unconscious biases. I don't know what you're
Which is,
talking about.
yeah, we're putting people
You're
on the
just
defensive, aren't we then?
exactly.
What's the
And so
point?
and people aren't going to listen. So you've got these two camps and they're unable to hear each other. And my point is, look, it's not about you have to interrogate your unconscious biases. It's more, well, look, you want to be a
Reflection.
successful person. You want to be emotionally intelligent. You want to be able to hire the right people for your company. You want to be able to know how to talk to your boss in an emotionally intelligent way. So all of those things require you to be self-aware about your own unconscious biases, and it's just about developing in life and becoming a better person. And I put that within inverted commas just
Mm.
because you're learning skills. It's skilled, and it's like learning another language. That's all it is. It's just gaining
No,
another
you're
skill.
well said, exactly. And I mean, if you were seeing me, I'm nodding my head vigorously in agreement with you. I was thinking of a story that someone shared with me. This is many years ago now, and I was just thinking about the power of unconscious bias and how, the point is it's unconscious and we don't know. And there was this young man in India, and he would probably be now in his, I don't know, 50s, I'm guessing. And 30, 40 years ago, he was in school, I think about 40, when he was over 10 years old. He was in school and they were having whole school assembly. And for those of us who don't know what that is, it means when parents are invited and so on. So all the children were at the back and the parents, the adults, were in the front. And he, being just a kid of 10 or 12, was bored and he was scrunching up pieces of paper and flicking it into the audience. Well, he got caught and he was taken up on stage and he was asked to kneel in front of his parents and his friends' parents and everybody else for the rest of assembly. Now, the poor boy was so traumatized by this particular experience. So fast forward many years, and he was telling this, sharing this story with me. He recognized that he was finding it, he didn't know at the time, but with the benefit of hindsight, unconsciously, he was finding it very difficult to work with leaders and managers. He wanted to be in charge of his own decisions. So he kept coming in and out of various different jobs. And he only ended up becoming successful when he reflected and understood what that trauma had done to him. He started his own
Right.
company, and long story cut short, he was a very successful entrepreneur. But when you hear stories like that, Katharine, what kind of stories come to your mind about your own unconscious biases?
Well, one that I'm always very much aware of when I'm hiring, I think it's uh, very easy. I think this is the case with everyone, frankly. It's not just me. I think it's very easy to hear a certain kind of accent and to see a certain that a candidate might present themselves in a certain kind of fashion. And when I say a certain kind of accent, I basically mean kind of public school type accent, and assume that that person is much better than they actually are. And it's unconscious. You naturally do it, and because they can be quite articulate, because their schools have taught them well, because they have a certain kind of accent, because that's how the children talked at their school, and because they might be quite confident in their manner, the way they sit down on a chair, the way they shake your hand, the way they look at you in the eye, the way they get themselves up from a chair, the way they walk. All of these things are learned habits that they have taken on over many years of being in the environment that they were in school. And
Hmm.
they all signal to the employer that that person is capable, skilled, intelligent, hardworking, trustworthy. All of these characteristics you will assign without really thinking about it. And then if you get another candidate who has perhaps been to a state school, not a very good state school, doesn't speak in the same kind of fashion, etc., you could easily just assume that the first candidate is the better person for the job. And I think you can miss out. So here's an example of you can miss out on actually hiring the best person for the job because of your own unconscious biases. And that's a problem for you as an employer. And so it's something that I always keep a check on for me, because I don't want to be tricked, as it were, by those superficialities. Because actually what I want is somebody who's super intelligent, super quick in the classroom, somebody who is very hardworking, very dedicated, and will be able to, has a certain kind of flexibility. I mean, great teachers are extremely flexible in the classroom and can jump from one thing to the next and then change their minds and, oh, haven't explained that properly, and I'll take a step back and move forward, and they can feel the room, and they have a high amount of emotional intelligence, not just raw intelligence, but an emotional type of intelligence, which is required in the classroom, and to make the right judgments. And so I'm just aware that those superficialities that I spoke about in terms of confidence and accent and so on can trick you into thinking that they can do the stuff in the classroom better than somebody who doesn't have those superficial characteristics. And I'm just aware of that. So you just have to keep checking yourself. And that's the thing with unconscious bias, with any type of unconscious bias. Once you know yourself, and being self-aware is so important for success in life. Not just with regard to unconscious bias, but with regard to everything. I know I'm very loud, I know that I can talk too much, and so when I am talking too much, I can sometimes check myself and say, oh, Katherine, have you said too much here? Come on, shut up, let the other person go, that is, that makes the person more successful, because they can alter their behavior in order to make other people feel more comfortable around them.
So true, because we had to first, if the self-awareness is not there, then how would you know that we're not talking enough, or we are talking too much, or any of that? And the point about accent is so right, because I've had so many stories similar to what you're saying. And it's not just about a state school versus, say, private school educated accents. It could be even somebody coming from Birmingham to London to work, or somebody coming from Nigeria to London to work, and based on their accent. And I remember a Nigerian person saying to me, I know I'm very good at what I do, but there's no way that I'm going to be getting one of those senior positions because I have a strong Nigerian accent. And it breaks your heart when you hear stories like that.
Yeah.
So it's a very valid point. But other than recruitment, because I hear your accent, Katherine, and you don't have a typical English accent, whatever that sounds like these days, a London accent, there is a little tinge of something else. So do you want to tell us a little bit about where did you get that accent from, and why do you sound the way you do? What are your stories and your unconscious biases maybe in relation to that?
Well, I grew up in Canada. My parents are from the Caribbean. My father's from Guyana. My mother's Jamaican. I was born in New Zealand, weirdly enough. And then I grew up for the main part in Canada. But at age 15, I came to England. And it was certainly a bit of a shock coming to England, and the differences in terms of, I would say actually in terms of race for me when I came. I lived in Leamington Spa, and I was at a mainly white school. And while there may have been problems with race in Canadian schools where I went before, I did have, it was very different when I came to England. So, being called the P word, or being left out of friendship groups and things like that hadn't necessarily happened to me in such a big way as they did to me in the 1980s in England. Of course, I think England has vastly transformed since those times, but I do think in those days, I think there were, big issues around race in the 1980s in England, which is one of the reasons why, I'm always very vocal about the fact that I think England is such a great country to live in now with regard to race. And when people are highly critical of it, again, I would point back to when I said the advocates for unconscious bias slam this stuff down people's throats. Similarly, when people are talking about racist Britain, and of course, Britain does have issues of race, and we need to address those. I don't think they're anywhere near as bad as people sometimes make them out to be in 2020, and that Britain has come a very far way from where it was in the 1980s. But yes, and then I've been here ever since. Really, I've been here for over 30 years, so a long time.
No, it's interesting because obviously, this whole idea, because you came as a young person, and then you're understanding and engaging and accepting and having your own identity. All this is part of our own unconscious bias. And I was thinking of that. You might have seen it, the Channel 4 experiment television documentary called the school that tried to end racism, where they took year 6 children and tried to help them understand what is unconscious bias. I mean, did you see it? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I must say I don't look kindly on this sort of thing. I do think that we need to allow children to be children. And yes, unconscious bias is a thing, as we've just discussed. And yes, I think we should all think about it and become more skilled at being better people. But I don't believe that it's something that we should be looking at in schools. I don't believe that children, in particular white children in this case, should be made to feel as if they've done something wrong. Because the point about unconscious bias is that it's not just to do with race, it's to do with everything,
Of course it is.
all of the
Yes.
time.
Yes.
And so, you meet someone and you hear they're a conservative, so you assume that they must not be very nice, or you hear that they are a supporter of Corbyn, therefore they must be, I don't know, pro-environment, for instance. You assume you assume things about people on all kinds of levels. And that's impossible to address in a school context. And I don't think it's appropriate for school. School teaches you maths and English and history and geography and so on. I do think that it's worth thinking about one's unconscious biases, but I also think, we aren't teaching them emotional intelligence. I mean, it's not something, it's not appropriate for school. And I also just think that this push on unconscious bias just being about race but makes white people feel very uncomfortable. And I understand why they feel uncomfortable, because it's not fair to single them out as the only people who have unconscious bias, because we all do on a great many number of different things.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that's why this podcast is so important to me, because I have had some amazing stories shared with me from different people from different parts of the world who say, who share their stories. And it isn't about just, this whole business of white or black. It's much more nuanced than that. And all of us will always have unconscious biases. Absolutely. But
Well,
just
okay, but I mean, like a story, for instance, that people won't necessarily think. So, as a black girl growing up in Toronto, and then later here, you know, and I was in a school with mainly white, I mean, all white children, and in all the various schools I was in, and I was always the odd one out. So I didn't belong. When they would have a school dance, I would be sat on the bench and no boy would ever ask me to dance. Now, what the effect of that was that I grew up thinking that I was just ugly. That I used to, I believed that. I just thought it was really sad. I was really ugly and all these other girls were pretty. And I hated my hair. And I hated my hair because it was black afro type hair as opposed to long straight blonde hair like my best friend. And I knew that I was the problem and I was unattractive. Now, that's no one's fault, and I don't think that it would have been right to have pulled all the white children aside and said, you're unconsciously biased, and to have said to the boys, you're not asking Katherine to dance because she's black and you have to ask her to dance. I mean, that's just weird, right? I mean, that's weird. And I would have felt very uncomfortable had that happened. But at the same time, it's quite good to be aware of these things, because when I got older and grew up, and I suppose when I was in my 20s, used to think it was the story of the ugly duckling, that I had been ugly and that I just became more attractive later when I was older. When actually, that's not what happened. It wasn't that I was unattractive. It was that I was the little black girl in a white class. That's what it was. And I didn't understand that as a child. Now, but that's okay. That doesn't mean my life is over. I mean, you get to a certain age, you look back, you analyze, you think, oh, that's why that happened, and that's why I thought I was ugly, and I'm not scarred for life. I'm okay. I mean,
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you're saying the way you're saying it, because it's. I think I read something, or maybe it was either a tweet or a video or something of yours, and what I'm paraphrasing what you're saying is it's about being comfortable in your own skin, isn't it? I mean, when you grew
indeed.
up. And I think what I also remember reading is that you work very hard at making sure that every single child in your school is comfortable in their own skin. So, but how does that work? Because that so much is about challenging our own stories, because your narrative,
Yes.
listen, at the end of the day, let's face it, it was painful. You sitting on the side, watching all these kids dance couldn't have been easy for you. Yet you
No.
seemed to manage it, and you did become more comfortable in your own skin. And that's a lot of people are not able to do that, you see. You
Yes,
had
it's
the
a good
wisdom and the
point.
self-reflection. But a lot of
Later,
people, they
later,
can be 45, but could be. But the point is, they could now be 45, 55
and
years
still
old,
not have
and they
done
are
it.
still
Mm.
not in that situation. And
Okay.
that's what makes it so difficult for them. That's the thing.
Yes, but what I would say is that we all have obstacles in life. We all have. So you might look at, my best friend at the time who was blonde and beautiful and all the rest of it. I mean, and I'm still very good friends with her. And life has given her all sorts of knocks along the way. and and just because I'm black and she's white doesn't mean that I'm going to have more knocks. Actually, life is complex, and so where we go wrong in society is just making an assumption because of what someone looks like that they've necessarily had more or fewer obstacles than someone else. And the other mistake we make is that, yes, you're right. I am quite resilient. I am somebody who picks myself up when I fall down and I keep on going. So, I didn't let that stop me, even though I thought I was ugly. I just thought, well, I'm ugly. I'll just have to live a life as an ugly girl. And that's how it is. But then later I was able to kind of analyze that and sort it out and not let it have such a negative impact on my life. Although you are right that it has had impact. So why do I want the children to feel comfortable in their skin? Possibly because I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin. What do I do when I have conversations with some of our young girls who want to they try and over sexualize themselves and they want to make themselves available to boys because they think the only way in which they can get a boy is to push out their bottoms and put on lipstick and make themselves look much older, and or to do things, sexual treats that they really shouldn't do just in order to get a boy's attention. And they do that because they're so convinced that they're not attractive and that the only way that they can get a boy's attention is by doing other things. And so I can have conversations with them and I can say, I know what it's like not to feel attractive. I know what it's like to feel like you do. And there's a connection there. So yes, these negative experiences can have positive outcomes later, as long as you're able to identify them, to work them through, and to own them. And that's what's important in life. As I said, you spend life developing and figuring yourself out and being self-aware. But you're right that not everybody can do that. But then I'd say, well, we need to help them do that. I don't think the solution is to go to the rest of the world and say, you need to change. I don't think the solution for me was to go to those boys and say, you have to ask Katherine to dance. I think the solution is for me to learn how to cope with that particular obstacle in life. And then, obviously, generally speaking, we talk to everybody as we're doing now. We talk about unconscious bias. We suggest to, I talk to my staff about exactly this sort of thing and how we want to be self-aware and about everything, not just about race, because we want to be better people. Yeah, does that make sense?
Completely and totally makes sense. And I love the fact that because so many of us, obviously, life is cyclical. We will have ups, we will have downs. And if we are able to reflect on the problems, the challenges that we've had, and then turn it around. And so that was your unconscious bias. When you finally reflected on it, you recognize that, you know what, I've got to try and help other people not go through the same issues that I did as a teenager in school. And
Yes.
that they're lucky kids, as far as I'm concerned, to have you as their headmistress, to have these really open, honest conversations with them. And that I completely, totally agree with you. But yes, so could you share another story, Katherine, perhaps from another angle, perhaps if it's not your unconscious bias, maybe somebody else's? I'm just thinking
Yeah.
aloud, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously there's lots of situations like that for me in particular with regard to race, I suppose. I mean, my whole struggle, for instance, to set up the school, I think, is inextricably bound in race. The white middle class Guardian readers who were so determined to stop me, I think, in part is because of my skin color. They couldn't stand to see a black woman taking control and being conservative and doing things the way she thought they needed to be. That there are too many of them who want to patronize Black people and want to help them. You know, they love the idea of the white knight in shining armor swooping in and feeding the Africans and saving the Black people who are unable to save themselves, and that it gives them a real boost. They feel powerful and they feel good and virtuous, and that when a Black person decides to say, no, actually, I don't need your help. I'm going to do this on my own and I'm going to make this happen. And actually, I don't agree with you on many of the ideas that you have about Black people and about kids in schools and about what they can achieve and about what's necessary to help them achieve. And that I'm going to do exactly the opposite to what you've been doing in your schools. And that not only that, I'm then successful at doing it. They can't stand it. It makes them so angry because it makes them feel inadequate and just not needed, you know. And the reason why they love giving their time to this sort of thing is because it makes them feel virtuous and good. And you know, so you know, this is the brigade of people who put up black boxes on Instagram and say, look, I'm not racist. You know, they love that, and they look at me, I'm feeding the African child. But when the African child can feed himself, which is where real power is, and that's what I say about the unconscious bias there. It's not for those boys to be forced to dance with me. It's for Katherine to figure out how to cope without them dancing with her. And when I figure out how to cope with that, when I figured out how to, because it's partly being able to figure out how to cope with being ugly, that I've also figured out how to do things differently and turn things on their head in terms of education. And I've done that, and they don't like it. They hate it. And what I keep doing is I keep pointing my finger back at them and saying, you say other people are racist, well, you need to interrogate your own racism, because I think this is all about racism and all about race when it comes to this, that it galls them that when Black people are able to turn around and say, no, I reject what you say and I'm going to do things differently. And so, yeah, that I think is a perfect example of unconscious bias. And I think it exists very much within the left. And of course, there's racism on the right, loads of it. I mean, and people are all very kind of clear about what that kind of racism looks like. And they imagine kind of the National Front and that sort of thing. Or, you know, they might talk about unconscious bias, actually, of racism on the right. What they don't do is talk about it on the left. And in talking about it on the left, I think it's very pernicious because it's not seen. You see, they see it on the right, and people are very clear about what racism looks like on the right. They are not clear about what it looks like on the left, and it comes in disguise, that racism, and it looks like people are being helpful. But because what they're doing is feeding their own desire to seem virtuous, I've put a black box up on Instagram, because that's what they're doing, and they're not actually interested in the outcomes about whether or not actually racism has been reduced by that black box. They're not interested in that. Or actually, are our schools succeeding? Is maybe perhaps what Katharine Birbalsingh says about children in the inner city and what they need and don't need? Maybe we should be listening to this, but they shut down, and they shut down because they're not actually interested in the outcomes. What they're interested in is feeling like they are virtuous, and that is, I think, you know, the difference between being virtuous and signaling virtue. Massive unconscious bias that is throughout our society. I would not just on the left, also on the right, but I think it is a particular characteristic of the left.
Would that be your conscious bias? Do you think? I'm going to be kind of pushing the buttons a tiny bit and say, would that be your conscious bias?
What do you mean?
That the left, in terms of, you know, the left are a certain way and the right are a certain, because that's what I'm hearing. Now, I'm a Guardian reader, as an example. I mean, I'm not white, but that's not the point.
No, it is. It is actually. You not being white makes a big difference.
But my concern, though, is that even I'm not. I think what it's the point about unconscious bias is trying not to put people into boxes, and therefore.
No, so obviously not all white Guardian readers are like this, but there is a trend amongst them. Look, the ones who, you don't hate our school, you're also not white, but you also don't hate our school. You haven't campaigned to try and stop us from opening. You haven't been at parents' evenings and infiltrated in order to stand up and shout me down when I'm talking. You haven't sent me racist emails. You haven't stood outside our school with protest cards with Tory teacher written on them. And you haven't forced me to hire bouncers because I'm so worried about the violence that might ensue because these people are going to attack me. You know, you haven't done that. So I'm talking about these people, and I'm explaining why they are so emotional about it and why they are so committed to trying to stop our school from succeeding.
And that, of course, is showing their own unconscious biases, is the point that you're making, which is a very powerful and very emotive point that you've made. So I really appreciate that, because it isn't just about the expectations of political affiliations and how people should behave. It's much more than that. That's exactly what you're saying. I appreciate that.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that because they're not aware of their unconscious bias, they actually believe that what they're doing is right. And I would say that they don't realize that what the number one thing that's motivating them is racism, is what I would say. Now, I mean, there's a lot of people who disagree with me, not just the people on the left, people on the right, because many people on the right refuse to recognize how complex racism is. And they just deny that it exists. And they deny it exists because the people on the left are constantly bludgeoning them with it. So, and when they're bludgeoning them with it, the people on the right go, no, it doesn't exist. And so the people in the middle who recognize that racism isn't just black and white, it's actually far more complex, and it reveals itself unconsciously in all kinds of ways, both on the right and on the left. The reason why I'm quite vocal about what happens on the left is partly because I'm often the victim of the left's racism, but it's also because I think people are far more conscious of racism on the right, and they understand it much better. And it tends to be, we tend to just think of people on the right are racist, people on the left are not, because people on the left are good. And I'm saying, no, what they're doing is signaling virtue. They are not actually being virtuous.
That's very exactly what. So what you're saying is, let's not make things so simple, because that actually makes it's a more divisive society if you put people into blocks, and that is why suggesting that left and right behave in a certain way, or even, it's not just that, it could be even private schools versus state schools. Not all children from private schools are like so, and not all children from state schools are like so.
Of course.
It's a combination of who we are as human beings, and it's about accepting that every one of us might come with different stories and different life experiences, rather than just because somebody reads this paper they like so, and somebody who votes for such and such is like so. Yeah, I get that totally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is what we were saying earlier. I mean, the fact is that people have unconscious biases on a huge number of things. I mean, of course, it's quite funny because I'm saying it's not just about race, and I've talked quite a lot about race, but the fact is it isn't. People have biases about all sorts of things. I mean, I don't know, there's some guys outside working on the road right now, digging it up. If they told me they listen to Mozart regularly, I'd probably be surprised, because my unconscious bias is such that I don't imagine that they do listen to Mozart. And there's an example of just every day, all the time, we have biases. But the point is, those biases are also what help us. They help us to survive. You have to be second guessing things all of the time, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to function as a human being. So the difficulty for people is figuring out, okay, you need to make these unconscious bias decisions constantly, because you are, but then also knowing when to interrogate some of them to make sure that they're not actually making you weaker as opposed to stronger.
But how are we going to do that, Katharine? That's the million-dollar question, because that's hard. So how do you do it? How do you manage your own unconscious biases?
Well, I mean, I don't know. You're just try and be as self-aware as you can. And recognize, I think this is important, recognize that not all unconscious bias is necessarily bad, and that actually it helps us to survive. So, because you're making decisions all of the time, split-second decisions. You get on the tube and you make an assumption about, I don't know, any number of different things. Somebody opens a door or doesn't open a door. Are they doing it because they're being nice? Are they doing it because they think you're, whatever? You're constantly thinking on. You're constantly making such decisions. I don't know. I mean, you think about, important bits. Like, notice I talk to you about when I'm hiring, because that's really important. And so it's really important I get that right. Whether or not I assume that the guys working on the road listen to Mozart isn't going to make, doesn't matter so much. So I haven't lost any sleep over whether or not I think they listen to Mozart. And I'm not, at the end of this conversation, going to go outside and ask these guys, do you listen to Mozart? Because I don't want to misjudge you, because otherwise I'm a terrible person if I don't realize that you listen to Mozart.
Yes.
I mean, you've also got to be forgiving about these sorts of things. The problem with the unconscious bias brigade is that they're extremely unforgiving, and they behave as if they themselves don't have biases, and they bludgeon other people and say you are a bad person for having them, when in fact it's perfectly normal to have them, and you wouldn't survive in life if you didn't have them. I mean, I think that is an important point. So look, everyone should be more self-aware, not just to do with unconscious bias, but just generally. Like I said, I speak too much, or I'm loud, or I'm quite confident at times, but other times I may not be so confident. I can be quite shy. Understanding when I'm shy and understanding when I don't have to be so shy. You want to know about yourself so that you can put yourself in situations where you're more likely to be successful. When it comes to people on my senior team, for instance, I think carefully about making sure that I make up for my own weaknesses. I'm very bad at timetabling, very bad at numbers and all that sort of thing. It's not my strength. So I make sure that I have somebody really good on my senior team who can make up for that weakness of mine. I surround myself with people who make up for my weaknesses. That requires a self-awareness to be able to do that. Not just about unconscious bias, but just about who you are.
And I think that, and the other very, very important point that you said is to be forgiving. And I think that I really want the listeners to think about. Don't be so hard on yourself. Be kind to yourself, because we all, every one of us in this, have unconscious biases. Try and be self-aware, and at the same time, be kind to yourself and be forgiving. That's wonderful.
Yes.
And very, very good advice. Katharine Birbalsingh, I really appreciate your sharing your stories of unconscious bias. Hugely enjoyed it. I think, the listeners are going to get a lot out of this conversation. So thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun, actually. I haven't had a conversation like that on any podcast I've done. So, it was really interesting. Thanks.
No, thanks again. Thank you for listening to my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. If you enjoyed hearing this episode, do tune in every Saturday for a new interview. And if you could share, leave a review and rating, that would be hugely appreciated. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter @Smita Tharoor, and feel free to suggest new guests. Until next week.